My name is Peter Andras. I'm a professor at Edinburgh Napier University. This is my lecture series on the evolution of complex systems. This is lecture 1, the introduction, and this is part 2 of lecture 1. So, as I discussed previously, we consider for the introduction a series of systems that we consider how they evolved. First, we looked at biological evolution. In the second part, we look at the evolution of the educational system. So think about how education worked over history. So in the really ancient times and to a large extent in the Middle Ages, education mainly happened by learning at home as part of the daily socialization of children. So they would learn, for example, the trade of the father, or they would learn the general knowledge that they need for living, the customs of the society, and so on. But mostly, this kind of education, at least at early ages, it happened through family socialization. Now, if we go further, a few hundred years, in the time of the Middle Ages, what we see is that there are schools associated with churches. For example, in the Carolingian Empire, there were schools established in association with local churches. Education in the church school essentially guaranteed a position in the church, or at that time, church administration and government administration were closely linked. So at that level, at that age, education, in addition to the home-based kind of everyday socialization, also took the form of church-related school-based education. Now here, the students or the pupils would learn mainly numeracy, like counting, adding together, subtracting numbers, possibly multiplying and dividing, and would also learn reading and writing. So it was mainly literacy and numeracy that was taught at that time in the formal education. And people who were able to read and write, who were able to do simple numerical tasks, they were practically on the line to position in church or in some government administration. Now, moving further, by around the kind of later Middle Ages, so this is 1200s, 1300s, several cities, in particular Italian cities, but also Paris, Cambridge, Oxford, Prague, and a few others, established universities. Now, these early universities were mainly about theology. So, my priests would work on their understanding of theological knowledge in monasteries. But in order to spread this knowledge, they started to establish universities which would cover the whole area of knowledge, of course, mainly around or really focused around theology. Now, later, the kind of more practical sciences of law and medicine would be added to the university curriculum, and universities would offer courses and degrees in law as well. The law emerges from kind of practical customs, legal customs of the land, and the legislation of the king, and the study of these and the elaboration on it. And of course, medicine emerges from from the kind of applied practical medical knowledge, partly of surgeons, partly of knowledge of plants, medicinal plants, and various medical procedures. So the law and medicine were much more practically driven compared to theology. Now, moving further, by the 17th to the 19th century, the trade schools appear in the educational system. So these are schools between the university level education and the primary, secondary education. Rather, these are essentially secondary education schools where people learn technical skills or commercial skills. So these are commerce schools, technical schools, which appear across Europe in many areas. And these are really focused on training in specific practical skills. Again, making another big jump. General elementary education, this reappears by the late 19th century, by the 20th century, early to mid 20th century. So this is really when the basic education of literacy and numeracy is provided for everybody, for every children. And this also includes some basic education in some sciences. So beyond learning of reading, writing, and counting, and perhaps a bit more mathematics, perhaps including, for example, geometry, these general education schools would also teach about geography, biology, some physics, perhaps a bit of chemistry. This made a quite significant change where the whole population finds available the education, and effectively it is made compulsory education to have a better educated population in society. Then the modern universities come around by the late 19th century, by early 20th century. Perhaps some roots may go back to the 18th century, but really, this is a time, maybe from mid-19th century onward, when universities are organized around research and sciences. So previously, universities are mainly about theology and sometimes law and medicine. But this is really kind of mid-19th century when the experimental sciences boom, following the late 18th century, early 19th century progress in that. And universities become very much focused on research and the kind of sciences emerging from natural sciences. Now, perhaps first these modern universities appear in Germany and then they spread around the world. And they offer the advanced level training in sciences and also the applications of these sciences to the practical life. Another major change in the education system happens by around the mid-late 20th century. So this is when standardized education exams become widespread, when the secondary education becomes almost general. So almost all children finishing from primary education go on and do their secondary education, where they learn a range of relatively advanced topics in sciences, but also in literature, history, and in practical topics as well. So this is in the context of a British context. This is the GCSE and A levels, and of course in many other countries they have the similar level of standardized testing and education for this, typically at the ages of 14, 16, or 18, or some combination of these. Then, by the mid-20th century, another change that we see in the education system is the emergence of the layered university system. So in Germany, there is the vocational university, the technical university, and the science universities. In the US system, there are community colleges, state universities, and the research universities. In Britain, there are further education colleges, the polytechnics, and universities. So essentially, in all these cases, what we see is that there are at the top end, there are the very much science and research oriented universities. Then there in the middle, there is a much more practically focused, but still providing advanced university level knowledge. Universities or polytechnics or other forms of university level education. Quite often these include teacher training, and quite often these include other more practically oriented training programs. And then, in addition to these two, there is the element of community colleges, vocational universities, further education colleges, which are even more practically oriented, perhaps don't really offer the standard university level depths in terms of the topics that are taught, but is much more practically oriented than the mid-range universities. Now, this kind of layered university system is an innovation. And again, what it does, it provides a much wider accessibility of advanced learning, advanced education compared to previous versions of how the education system works in societies. Then another element that adds to this system is the graduate school. So this is really starts by mid-late 20th century, and then by the 21st century it spreads across the whole university sector. This applies to the elite research-focused universities. So this is the kind of introduction of formal education at postgraduate level. So this is where the students graduate from their regular university degree and go on and get postgraduate training, advanced training in scientific research. And again, this is very interesting because it adds another much more advanced, really, it's an introduction into the current research world at a large scale. The PhD studies have been there before, but they were much less formalized in graduate schools. But this is the time when these graduate schools emerge and provide this kind of more formal, more standardized postgraduate level education. So we had a brief look at how education systems changed from ancient times to our current times. Of course, we skipped through many elements that have been there, but we focused on some key stages of how the education systems emerged, mainly in Europe, mainly Western Europe, and North America. So the question is, what drives these changes from one education system to another? What's the process that leads from the church-associated primary schools focused on literacy and numeracy to the graduate schools where the postgraduate training of in research and science happens? How did we do that? Now, also, looking at the evolution of the education system, can we say anything about what comes next? What's the future of education? What kind of likely forms of education are there? Of course, if you look around, we can see, especially now after the pandemic, that online education is there, but I have to say that the views on it have changed quite rapidly during the pandemic years. While at first it was a great step to move to online, and it proved to be a valid and robust way of delivering education. For the next couple of years, what turned out is that this is not really replacing the standard campus-based education, at least at universities, and certainly not at schools, where children and students learn and gain very much from the experience of being in a classroom, being together with other kids and students. So, online education is clearly around and is still with us, but the way how this is delivered, how it impacts education is unclear. So in general, it is still, well, it's quite unclear what comes next. And the predictions quite often turn out to be wrong. Now, if you look in a wider sense, how does economics and politics interact with education? Now, clearly, they do interact. Charging student fees makes a difference. Not charging them, again, sets up a very different system. Politics has a quite significant impact on education. Now, this might happen through the grassroots level, student organizations, or in some countries happens through the formal system. Think about China, for example, where or other similar countries where there is a state ideology that is part of the education system. So the question is how the interaction between politics, education, and economics influencing the evolution of education system. How can we understand that? And also, how this change in education system influences economics and politics? Because clearly it works both ways. How we educate students today will have an impact on the people who will make economics and politics decisions in the future. So how does it work? So looking at the whole system, so one key question is, what's the role of information and communication in the education system? How can we see the education system organized around information and communication? Now, clearly, what we said is that education system is about passing on knowledge, be that the everyday knowledge or scientific knowledge. But how can we see this kind of more clearly focused way on information and communication? And again, if we can do that, then how information and communication shape the evolution of education system? So if we understand how information and communication play a role in the education system, can we say something about how they influence the evolution of the education system? So in this second part, I discuss briefly the evolution of the education system across societies, mainly Western Europe. And we looked at some issues about how can we understand the evolution of the education systems. We just addressed some of these issues. We did not provide answers. That was not the purpose. But the aim of this part of this lecture is just to highlight an example of a system that we will be looking at in the context of these lectures on the evolution of complex systems. Thank you.